Every one of us, unfortunately, knows at least one person who is suffering with an issue with opioids. And I would contend that each of us has been personally affected in some way or another by the workforce shortages due to demographic and cultural shifts since the Great Recession. What I have come here to establish today is that both of these issues are the downstream effects of the same crisis. And the solution for both is simple in nature, but profound in impact. I uncovered this a few years ago, and it took me a little while to become articulate about how to share it with others, but this is the story of how it all began. After a few years of hosting social gatherings for our friends and our friends of friends, a group of us decided to take on our biggest challenge yet, an island party right off the coast of the city of Milwaukee. We were ill-prepared. Being novices to event planning, we forgot just about all the main ingredients: power, bathrooms, lights, enough food and drinks. And despite our poor planning skills, 3,000 people showed up. They listened to the music, they danced in the prairie grass, and we all watched this bright orange sunset together. How we managed to get away without any liability insurance or even any inkling of a negative incident is only by the grace of God, our good fortunes, or perhaps our extreme naivete. After the crowds had disbanded, a few of us that remained on the park decided to run into the lake, swimming under the stars and reveling in what we had just created. As I floated along and listened to the laughter of my best friends, I thought, this is it. This is what we do now. I laugh a little bit when I think about that moment in time because all we had actually done was host a really big party by mistake. And yet there was something more to it, and I could feel it that night. We had somehow managed to create a space for a few thousand strangers to gather together and to feel as though they belonged to each other and to the park, even if it was just for a few moments in time. Recreating that sense of belonging became what fueled our every waking moment. At a merciless pace, we hosted hundreds of events that drew thousands of attendees over and over, always chasing that same high, the reverberation that comes from the confluence of people gathering together and feeling connected to one another. The impact of those experiences always had a really profound effect, not only on our lives, but on the lives of those who attended, ones we could see and ones we would never be able to imagine. After hosting a bunch of different crazy experiences, we realized what we were doing was not exactly event planning. It was something more. We were studying what made people move, how to get them to take action, and how to change a narrative about a place. For the collective method we coined a new term, social architecture, the conscious design of an environment that shifts the social behavior of a population towards a goal. This transformative practice requires sincere thoughtfulness about inclusion and deep investment in network development prior to the beginning of planning the new event. What it results in, besides high event attendance, is meaningful buy-in from key constituents and some of the most diverse programs that the city of Milwaukee has to offer. Social architecture changes how people interact with both cities and companies alike. And while I stumbled into a makeshift career through fun and frivolity, I also discovered that belonging, the true byproduct of social architecture, is the solution for a growing public health crisis called social isolation. And now that I know that, I feel more empowered than ever to take on this epidemic by socially architecting all areas of our lives, including our workplace, where everyone goes every single day. Now, candidly, it took us about 10 years to establish this practice, and as we were working through that, the world shifted around us. Technology accelerated and changed the way our social systems, communication, and the economy all work. We live in a time of infinite possibilities to connect to one another, and yet as a society, we are actually growing lonelier. There are 212 different social media platforms available on the marketplace, and they're all designed to bring people together. And yet it turns out people who spend 2 hours or more on social media are 2 times more likely to feel lonely. People have hundreds, if not thousands, of social media connections, and yet in stark contrast, since 1985, the number of people who can claim to have no close friends has increased from 36% to 54%. Half of Americans claim to sometimes or always feel alone. and a quarter of us claim that we have no one in our lives who understands us. Generation Z, the digital natives amongst us, the kids coming up behind millennials, are arguably the most technologically savvy and connected generation, and they claim to be the loneliest. What this means is that likes and comments on social media do not translate to meaningful, authentic engagement. In fact, most of the time, those connections are used for self-promotion, not community building. And while there are a few technology solutions like meetup.com that aim to bring people together and increase the convenience of that, it turns out millennials are the first generation that would rather stay home than leave to socialize. We expect more and more from technology and less from one another, a reality that chips away at the fundamental human need for social interaction and causes all sorts of negative psychological down spirals. But let me be clear about something. This is not a young person problem. Social isolation does not discriminate against age, gender, race, or socioeconomic background. Today's scientists know that if we do not have the opportunity to connect socially, we are so ravenous for our neurochemistry to be rebalanced, we are likely to seek relief from anywhere. Social isolation is directly correlated to things like anxiety, depression, increased suicide, drug abuse, and the divisiveness we see in today's political landscape. In fact, those who do not have a regular opportunity to connect socially are 50% more likely to die prematurely. That means that loneliness is just as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. All of this, as you can imagine, affects our society. And while our social systems have shifted, so have our workplaces. Since the Great Recession, remote work is on the rise. Productivity gurus tell us to take less meetings, and the technology that's meant to make our work easier leads us away from our coworkers. Whether from working long hours or due to a lengthy commute, the amount of time we spend with one another at work is vastly diminishing. And this wasn't always the case. In the past, your workplace may have been where you had your friendships and sometimes even met your spouse. But the reality is the workplace is rapidly changing as people switch jobs multiple times or move to various cities over a career, and the gig economy makes finding steady work even more complicated. Most people live very transactional and transient lives in which their ability to connect to a community of people who look out for one another is no longer accessible. The point is, people are isolated, and there's a connection crisis brewing that affects our society, communities, and companies alike. And while this feels unstoppable and pervasive because who among us is really ready to give up the modern advances our technology affords, the solution is simple. The antidote is to create a sense of belonging by connecting people to places and experiences that ensure they get offline and meet one another in person. And while a lot has changed and we no longer have the social constructs of the past, the workplace still provides a very unique potential to be a source of daily social outlet. It is therefore incumbent on our employers to facilitate how we connect with one another. And this is the elusive secret to talent attraction and retention. It has nothing to do with a flashy marketing campaign or a cash incentive to move somewhere. It is the ability to realize that everyone everywhere is chasing that same exact thing. And the employers that are setting up systems right now to create a sense of belonging for their employees are the ones that will win this global war for talent. Now, I recognize the word belonging feels a little bit inappropriate for the workplace. After all, you've been offered a job, salary, benefits. Why is it your new boss's responsibility to ensure that you have friends too? Well, it turns out, though, only 1/3 of us claim to have a best friend at work, and when we do, we're 7 times more productive. Disengaged employees cost companies $500 billion a year. Plus, there's the added cost bonus and savings that takes place when an engaged employee helps with increased candidate referrals, longer employee tenure, and the overall brand mind share of the company as a great place to work. But I am not referring to forced funtivities for your employees to awkwardly mill about or roll their eyes at. What I am talking about has a formula, and it's based in the theory of social architecture. Again, the conscious design of, in this case, a workplace that shifts the social behavior of the workers towards a goal. The goals are complex: increased profitability, productivity, employee tenure, and customer loyalty. Hence, the solution has to be complex and, quite frankly, an innovative approach to taking on all these challenges. Social architecture allows for the shedding of the one-size-fits-all nature that's typical in corporate America and yields unprecedented results in all of these normal areas of success. And this is the formula for how you create belonging. Belonging begins with empowerment. Empowerment requires the recognition that people are individuals, not cogs in a wheel. Broad, sweeping generalizations and corporate policies are diametrically opposed to how people naturally move and use the world. Just because a cohort of employees is near to one another in age does not mean that they're at the same stage of their lives. Think of it, a 28-year-old can be single, married with children, divorced with children. Each one of those stages has way more to do with what will engage that employee than his proximity of his age to his peers. Because each one of those stages represents a very clear marker of transition for that individual. Transition from past priorities, from the ways in which what the company culture has to offer will ensure that they feel connected and a part of the team. Creating individualized engagement plans, then, is the best way to ensure that employees feel empowered to take on their roles and to propel their careers within the company rather than seek outlets elsewhere. The second step for belonging is connection, which goes beyond affinity. Most companies subdivide their engagement strategy into demographic categories. There's the women's group, the Asian group, the young people's group. What this does, once the novelty of the camaraderie wears off, is actually forge a new epicenter within the organization for this minority group to lament how they're not considered when the larger policies affect that group. Rarely are modes of intersectionality between those employee resource groups invested in, which would allow them to not only learn and grow from one another, but have a more powerful and dynamic voice in affecting the broader culture of that organization. The third step is having a mechanism for change to take place. There is no point in having a comment box or any modern variation of one without a system that allows someone to request a change and then be a part of creating the change they seek within that organization. And this has to be ubiquitous across the company, from the lowliest of entry level all the way up to the C-suite. Everyone's voice must be heard and at least considered for implementation. And finally, the consistency of the empowerment, connection, and the ability to build anew is the most important ingredient. Trust is shared experience over time. If folks do not see the values that are not only written in the handbook and the mission statement of the organization, but they're in action over and over, being used by everyone across the organization, there will be a mistrust that grows and becomes impossible for belonging to be a reality in that workplace. Given the struggle that companies currently have in attracting talent, ensuring a sense of belonging is felt by the employees they currently have is imperative for the growth of that enterprise. For if the employees who help to create that brand don't trust it, why would anyone else? And sadly, I don't believe the angst caused by the void of belonging we're facing in our society is going anywhere, especially as a mistrust of our politics, media, and other major institutions is at an all-time high. But companies have the power, and I would contend the responsibility to change this paradigm, as they are the ones who benefit most from having the people to make and buy their stuff. And despite all of the world's changes, people do still need to work, even in spite of that insatiable chase for something more. Can you imagine a world in which employees felt connected and whole every time they headed into work? Can you see the way that would change our society's social ills? All that needs to happen to bring forth this reality is for employers to offer the most mission-critical, but also basic human benefit they can afford: belonging. Thank you.